I love horror movies. I love the thrill and the adrenaline. I love the inevitable struggle between good and evil, between fear and bravery, and between persevering and giving up. The best horror movies, in my opinion, leave you shaken and unsettled, but with a renewed faith in humanity's ability to persevere through courage and sheer force of will. What I also love about horror movies is how they remind me of my childhood. Finishing a horror movie, I often feel inexplicably seen and comfortable. They speak to a part of my existence that very few other forms of art or media have touched. Now, before you get too concerned, let me take you back to when I was about 6 years old. I grew up in rural Vermont in the United States of America. I had a swing set out back, 2 loving parents, a fabulous little brother, the best dog in the world. I played football badly, sang in our local choir, and it was not uncommon for me to, for a week or so, bottle feed some orphaned lambs down the road in exchange for a carton of fresh eggs and perhaps a crisp $10 bill. Now, as a student of business and economics, I see that my salary negotiation skills could have perhaps used some work. But still, this doesn't sound like the beginning of a typical horror movie. Hear me out. Between the ages of about 6 and 11, living in my brain was a little bit like being the reluctant star of a horror movie that I don't remember auditioning for. I would foresee things that were horrific, and they were always implausible and often impossible. I would imagine that one friend's unwashed hand touching my clean one would somehow lead to the downfall of my entire family. That touching a contaminated light switch would somehow switch off my entire existence. Now, I wasn't sure how I was going to get from point A, an idyllic childhood in small-town America, to point B, certain doom, death, and despair. But that's the cool thing about horror movies and about life. It doesn't really have to make sense for the fear to be real. I knew intellectually, even from a young age, that the things that I was terrified of weren't really rooted in reality. The people I knew, of which there were many, who touched light switches and doorknobs and who would occasionally forego washing their hands with soap and water for hand sanitizer when hiking or camping, which we do a lot in Vermont, lived to tell the tale. And yet the fear was so visceral and so real that it was literally impossible to convince me that the things I was so terrified of were innocuous. And so, despite the best efforts of my parents and then my therapists, to protect myself, I retreated. I pulled into myself, not because I disliked the outside world, but because I was simply incompatible with it. I couldn't do normal kid things, like going to friends' houses or summer camp, or even playing with my fabulous little brother. Friends' houses were full of doors to open to get in, light switches to turn on so you could see, and parents' hands to shake to be polite. Summer camp was a cesspool of the shining level horror movie hazards, from swimming pools full of who knows what, and I still stand by that, to tennis rackets that probably hadn't been cleaned since the sport was invented. And I loved my little brother, and I still do. But at that time, I didn't trust him enough to let him into the bubble that I was carefully constructing around my daily life. I couldn't even hold his hand to help him cross the street. The extremity of my isolation grew, as did the severity of my symptoms. It was becoming clear that something was wrong, and that something was obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD. According to the US National Institute of Mental Health, OCD is a long-lasting disorder in which a person experiences uncontrollable and recurring thoughts, those are the obsessions, engages in repetitive behaviors, the compulsions, or both. People with OCD have time-consuming symptoms that can cause significant distress or interfere with daily life, end quote. That sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? And not very fun. In fact, the World Health Organization classifies OCD among the top 10 most debilitating illnesses in the world. Left untreated, it can completely derail your entire life. And I was no exception. By the time I received my official OCD diagnosis, I was taking 2-hour-long showers and washing my hands for 20 to 30 minutes until they cracked and bled. Even then, I would have to be physically removed and prevented from returning to continue washing myself. So it wasn't just that I couldn't bear to participate in society. I simply didn't have the time. My obsessions and the fear surrounding them were all-encompassing. My quality of life was so low, and had been for such a large percentage of my life, that I was beginning to lose motivation to continue fighting this seemingly never-ending battle with my own mind. It was becoming clear that without intervention, I was going to take my own life before my 11th birthday. And that was when everything changed. After a brief period at an inpatient children's mental institution or mental hospital, where I saw children in states that I still struggle to articulate to this day, I enrolled in what would be a 3-month-long, intensive, full-day exposure and response prevention therapy program. Exposure and response prevention therapy is a kind of therapy commonly used to treat OCD. It involves being intermittently exposed to one's triggers and then being unable to neutralize the negative response through completing the compulsion that the obsession demands. Put more simply, you have to do the scary thing, and then you can't do the thing that your brain tells you will make the fear bearable. I was in a group of about 10 other children between the ages of 8 and 18 years old. I watched as many of them over this period regained control of their lives, and yet I was failing to progress as quickly as they were. In order to be successful in exposure and response prevention therapy, you have to allow yourself to be cleansed by fear. You have to let it wash over you, sit in it for hours, and trust that you will somehow make it out the other side. And as much as we know I love cleansing and washing, this baptism by fear was not something that I was willing to submit to. And so I fought. I fought back against my parents, my therapists, and my own rational mind. I would sneak off, cheating during exposures, washing my hands to regain some temporary sense of control. In doing so, I prolonged the most difficult period of my life thus far. And then one day, it clicked. By this point, I had watched about a dozen students, children just like me, finish the program. And like I said, I was failing to progress. As an SSE student, like many of us, I wasn't used to failing at anything. And so I decided to change my approach. I decided to fully commit. I stopped sneaking off, stopped taking the easy way out. I decided to fully feel the fear with no distractions for the first time in my life. Instead of hiding from the monster under the bed, I got to my knees, looked it in its eyes, and tried to learn from it. That was when I began to finally see real progress. For the first time in years, I could touch doorknobs and light switches without having to sequester myself for hours after. The skin on my hands, which had previously been decimated by hours of overwashing, was beginning to heal itself. I could hold my brother's hand while we crossed the street. And to some people, this might not seem like a big deal. To me, it was everything. It was finally watching the horror movie instead of living it. The fear was still there, and it was still real. But there was perspective, there was distance, and there was hope. Facing my OCD was the most difficult thing I have ever done in my entire life. It was terrifying in a way that I can't really begin to put into words. Since then, I have performed in front of thousands of people in plays, in concerts, and now in speeches like this one. I've moved to countries where I knew no one, first at 15 years old. I attended and then chose to leave an Ivy League institution, which is what I'd been told I was supposed to want my entire life. There I had friends who I'd continue to love. I had professors who knew my name. I had a pretty set, clear path. And I chose to come here to SSE in Stockholm, Sweden, where in the beginning I knew no one, to try something different. A couple of years ago, like 1 in 5 women around the world, I survived a sexual assault that left me with post-traumatic stress disorder. And although PTSD and OCD are different, they're different disorders, they require different treatment modalities in many ways, I was able to use the tools that I learned when facing my OCD in order to feel the fear, acknowledge that it was real, and yet decide that I was not going to allow it to shape the way I live my life. Because I had the courage, the strength, and the support as a child to face my big fear, I have freedom now that 8-year-old Julia never could have fathomed. I believe we all have at least one big fear. Most of us have many. Now, what classifies a fear as a big fear isn't how other people would decide how scary that thing is. It's how you experience the thought of facing it in your body. For some people, it might be giving something up. For me, it was my compulsions. For you, it might be alcohol or another substance. It might be a codependent relationship or a restrictive relationship with food. For others, it might be trying something new. It might be moving to a new place. It might be setting boundaries with coworkers or with family members. It might be getting comfortable, being deeply uncomfortable by trying a new skill or learning a new language. For others still, it might be realizing that the worldview that they have held until now is no longer serving themselves or others. It might be coming to understand that you have been taught something that is fundamentally incorrect, and although that's not your fault, that it's your duty to question the ethics of the status quo. Now, all of this sounds pretty hard and not very fun, and the truth is it's not. So what's the incentive? Why face the big fear? Once you face your big fear, all of the little fears become so much more bearable. The power that you give yourself as a reward is bigger than anything you can get in a personal development book or in a podcast or even in a TED Talk like this one. Once you make the big move, for example, going up to that cute girl in the bar or asking your boss for a raise, or maybe looking a little silly while you fumble with trying to learn to play the guitar or badminton, all of that feels so much more doable. So, why do I love horror movies so much? Because they require you to feel the big fear. There's no hiding from the monster under the bed. You can't get away from the creepy twins or the unsettling cult. Everything has to be dealt with before you can enjoy the peace as the credits roll. And yes, that is scary, by definition. But do you know what's scarier? Living your whole life without realizing the boundless potential and opportunities that exist if you give yourself the chance to see them. Thank you.